There's a certain hush that settles over the world once the sun slips low enough to turn everything gold. That's when I like to sit out on the porch, the boards warm beneath my feet, the last light lingering on the trees across the road. I keep an old wooden radio by my chair. It doesn't play much anymore, just hums a little when I turn the knob. But that hum, it's a sound I've known my whole life. Sometimes I swear I can still hear it. The faint crackle of static, the whisper of a voice introducing the next song. And then, the soft bloom of a tune that once filled summer evenings. That radio belonged to my grandfather. I can still see him, broad shoulders beneath a faded cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a clean shave that smelled faintly of bay rum. He had a habit of whistling along to whatever song was playing, never quite on key, but always steady. When the day was done, he'd pour himself a glass of iced tea, ease into his rucker, and tune that radio until the sound came clear. Back then, we didn't need much more than that. A chair, a breeze, a bit of music, and time enough to listen. I remember the creak of the screen door behind me, the soft slap of it closing, and the faint thump of my bare feet on the boards as I joined him. The air smelled like honeysuckle and sawdust from his shed. "Come on out. Kiddo," he'd say, patting the chair beside him. "They are playing the good stuff tonight." And I'd sit, legs too short to reach the floor, listening. The sound drifted out into the evening, mixing with the chirp of crickets and the sigh of wind through the maples. Now, decades later, I sit on my own porch, the air a little cooler, the board a little older. The same hum, the same light, the same soft feeling of the world slowing down. When I run my hand over that radio's cracked varnish, I can feel all those evenings tucked inside it, every laugh, every song, every quiet pause between. The past doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it sings. The radio never came on fast. You had to coax it awake, twist a knob, wait for the tubes to warm, and listen as the static turned from chaos to music. Grandpa said patience made the sound sweeter. He bought that radio the year after he came back from the war. Said it was the first new thing he'd owned in a long time. A big mahogany box with rounded edges and a glowing dial, the kind that looked like a tiny sun when it lit up. Every night around supper, he'd plug it in and fine-tune the stations. I'd lean close, fascinated by the way his fingers danced over the dial, as if he were calling up ghosts from the air. Sometimes it was Hank Williams, crooning about lonesome highways. Other nights it was gospel, voices rising pure and strong, like they were trying to reach heaven before bedtime. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was the laughter of a radio comedy show, Grandma chuckling from the kitchen as she dried the last of dishes. Those sounds stitched the evenings together. They were the background to everything. The smell of frying onions, the click of his lighter as he lit a cigarette, the lazy whir of the ceiling fan. On weekends, the neighbors would stroll by, and if they heard a good tune coming from our porch, they'd wave, maybe call out, "Turn it up, oh." Grandpa always did. He said good music was meant to be shared. I didn't realize it then, but those nights were teaching me something. How to be still, how to let a moment fill the room, or the porch, or your chest. Grandpa didn't talk much about big things, not about war, worry, or what the future might hold. He just sat, tapping his foot to the beat, letting the world hum along with him. There's one memory I carry sharper than the rest. A summer evening when fireflies started rising from the grass, little sparks blinking against the dark. I was maybe 10, still small enough to lean against his side. He turned the volume low, and in that quiet space between songs, he said, "You know, kiddo, you remember sounds longer than faces. That's why the good ones stay with you." I didn't understand it then, but I do now, because every time I hear that soft hiss of static, I'm back on that porch. The radio hums. The crickets sing. And somewhere, Grandpa is still whistling off-key, like he always did. Our house sat halfway down Sycamore Street, where the pavement turned to gravel and kids played barefoot until the street lights blinked on. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a front porch that leaned a little, and paint that never seemed to dry right no matter how often Grandpa touched it up. To me, it was perfect. The porch was our stage, our living room, and sometimes our church pew. When the radio came alive, the whole block seemed to slow down. Grandma would sit in her rocker, fanning herself with a church bulletin. She'd hum while the music played, her lips curving just slightly, eyes half closed. Every now and then, she'd say, "Oh, turn that up, that's the one I like." Grandpa would grin, give the knob a little twist, and the sound would roll out strong and clear, a melody carrying through the open windows, down the street, over the hum of cicadas. I used to sit on the steps, tracing lines in the dust with a stick, half listening, half dreaming. I remember the coolness of the porch boards against my palms, the smell of Grandma's lilac perfume, and the faint tinny echo of the radio bouncing off the porch rail. Our world was small, but it was full. The neighbors, the McKinneys, the Hollises, and old Mrs. Porter would pass by on their evening walks. Someone would always call out a greeting, and Grandpa would answer without moving his eyes from the radio. "How's she sound tonight?" "Oh," they'd tease. "Sweet as ever," he'd reply. Sometimes, if the air was just right, the radio would catch a faraway station. The music came faint and ghostly, but that made it feel magical, like voices traveling hundreds of miles just to find us. I think that's what I miss most about those days. The way everything felt connected. A man in another state could be singing into a microphone, and somehow, through static and sky, his song would land on our porch in our little house on Sycamore Street. It was more than just sound. It was belonging. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear it, the slow sway of Grandma's rocker, Grandpa's hum under his breath, the way the world seemed to hush itself just to listen. If Friday nights were for resting, Saturdays were for music. By late afternoon, Grandma would be in the kitchen, humming to herself as she rolled out dough for a lemon pie. The whole house would smell like sugar and citrus, and every so often she'd say, "Oh, you make sure that radio's working tonight. I don't want static during the good songs." Grandpa would grin like she'd asked him to tune the moon. He'd take the back panel off, wipe down the tubes, blow away the dust with slow, deliberate puffs of breath. That radio was like an old friend. It needed tending, care, a bit of patience. By dusk, the pie would be cooling on the sill, and the screen door would be propped open to let the evening in. The world outside smelled like honeysuckle and grass clippings, and the first fireflies blinked lazily over the yard. The program always started the same way. "Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Saturday Serenade." And just like that, the house would soften. Grandma would settle beside Grandpa on the porch swing, handing him a slice of pie, still warm. The light would dim, and the music would take over. Some songs made her sigh, those soft, crooning ones that carried the ache of a long-ago dance. Others made her tap her slipper against the floor, a quiet rhythm that matched Grandpa's gentle whistle. I'd sit cross-legged on the rug inside the screen door, watching the two of them sway together, not dancing, exactly, but remembering how it felt. It was a picture I didn't realize would brand itself into my heart. The way she'd lean her head against his shoulder, the way the lamplight caught the silver in her hair, the way Grandpa's hand would rest over hers as if to say, "I'm still here. We still have our song." The pie would cool, the crickets would rise in chorus, and for a little while, time would stop, held still by music, lemon, and love. One summer evening, the sky turned the color of old pewter. Grandpa was already out on the porch, watching the clouds crawl over the horizon. The air felt heavy, swollen with rain not yet fallen. Grandma called out from the kitchen, "You better unplug that radio before it fries again." He just chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on her." But before long, the wind picked up and thunder rolled through like a passing train. The radio crackled, struggling to hold its signal. For a moment, there was nothing but static, loud, restless, alive. I remember how the lightning flashed across the yard, lighting up the trees, and how Grandpa sat there, calm as a preacher, eyes on the sky. When the rain finally came, it hit the porch roof in a soft, relentless rhythm. Tap, 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 like a drummer marking time. Then, almost shyly, the radio came back to life. Through the hiss and hum, a man's voice sang slow and steady. "We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when." Grandma came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She smiled, and in that glow of lamplight and rain, the years seemed to melt off her face. "Would you listen to that?" she said softly. Grandpa reached for her hand. "Been listening all my life." They stood there together, him barefoot on the boards, her still holding the dish towel, while the storm wrapped around the house like a blanket. Even now, when I hear rain on the roof, I think of that night, the way the thunder softened, the way the music refused to quit, and how love, like a good radio, keeps finding its signal through the static. Time has a way of sneaking up on you. One year, the leaves turned earlier than usual. The air felt thinner, quieter. Grandpa's hair went from silver to white, and the radio, faithful old thing, started showing its age. The stations that once filled our evenings began to fade. One by one, they went silent, replaced by new sounds, faster songs, sharper voices, the kind that made Grandpa frown and shake his head. "This isn't music," he'd mutter. "This is noise." I tried to defend it. After all, I was a teenager then, full of my own rhythms, my own discoveries. I'd slip a transistor radio into my pocket, tune it to whatever the kids at school were talking about. But even as I tried to pull away, something in me always drifted back to the porch. Grandpa didn't hold it against me. He just smiled that slow, patient smile of his. "Every generation's got its own tune," he said. "But the old songs, they're the ones that keep you steady." One evening, I found him sitting out there alone, the radio silent. "Can't find a good station anymore," he sighed. So I brought my own little radio out, turned the dial until I found a big band tune, something halfway between his world and mine. When the horn swelled and the drums brushed soft, his eyes lit up. "Now that's more like it," he said. For a while, we just sat there, two worlds crossing over the airwaves. I realized then that music didn't belong to any one time. It belonged to memory, to moments shared, to laughter that lingers. It was the first time I saw him not as someone from the past, but as someone carrying it gently, proudly, into the future. By the time the maples turned gold that year, the house on Sycamore Street felt different. Grandma moved slower, taking more break between chores. Grandpa still kept his seat on the porch, but he'd sometimes doze off mid-song, his hands resting on his knees. The radio, too, had grown tired. It still played, but its voice was softer, a whisper instead of a melody. Sometimes I'd tap the side to bring the sound back, but Grandpa would stop me. "Let her be," he'd say. "She's sung enough for one lifetime." We all knew what he meant, though none of us said it out loud. That autumn was full of small kindnesses, warm blankets, extra sugar in the tea, long silences that felt like prayers. When Grandma's health began to falter, Grandpa sat closer to her chair, never far from reach. He'd hum her favorite hymns, even when his own voice trembled. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I caught a moment I'll never forget. The radio was playing "You Belong to Me." Grandpa took Grandma's hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her skin. She smiled faintly, eyes half closed, whispering, "Still our song, oh." He nodded. "Always will be." Outside, the leaves fell quiet as snow. Inside, the music filled every corner, soft and golden. That night, after they went to bed, I sat on the porch alone, the radio beside me. The song had ended, but the echo lingered, the kind that settles in your chest and stays. And I understood something I hadn't before. Some love stories don't end. They just keep playing, long after the last note fades. The first winter after Grandma passed was quiet in a way I hadn't known quiet could be. The house still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets and lemon polish, but the rooms had a hollow sound. Even the floorboards creaked softer, as if they were trying not to disturb the air. Grandpa still rose early, made his coffee black, and sat by the window that looked out toward the old oak tree. But he didn't turn on the radio much anymore. When I asked him why, he said, "Music sounds different without someone to share it with." It broke my heart a little, hearing that. But I understood. For months, the radio sat untouched on the shelf, its cord coiled neatly like a sleeping cat. The dust gathered on the knobs. One snowy afternoon, I came by to check on him. He was sitting by the fire, staring at the empty chair across from him. I brought in a record player I'd found at a second-hand shop, a little beat up but working fine. "Got something for you," I said. He looked at it like I'd brought in an old friend. When the first crackle of the needle hit, the sound was rough but alive. A familiar voice filled the room. "I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places." He leaned back, eyes closed, and I saw the smallest smile touch his face. "She always did love that one," he whispered. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel empty. The song filled the corners, stirred the air, and carried her memory gently between us. When it ended, he didn't say much, just nodded, and said, "Guess she's still listening somewhere." After that winter, Grandpa began writing letters. Not to anyone who'd write back, just letters to Grandma, to old friends long gone, to the people he'd carried in his heart for decades. He'd sit at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling beside him, and write slowly in that careful script of his. Sometimes I'd walk in and he'd tuck the paper aside, embarrassed. "They are not really letters," he'd say, "just ways of keeping company." The radio came alive again, too. He'd tune it to the public station, mostly old shows, local news, and the occasional swing tune they still played on Sunday evenings. That crackle, that hum, it felt like the pulse of the house again. Sometimes I'd visit and find him half asleep in his chair, the radio mumbling softly beside him. Once, I asked if he ever thought of getting a new one, something more modern. He chuckled. "No sense fixing what still remembers your name." That line stayed with me. There's something about old things. They hold on to the ghost of who we were. The knobs worn down by familiar fingers, the scratches on the wood that tell their own quiet stories. One evening, as I helped him to bed, I noticed he'd left a letter under the radio. It read, "If the music ever stops, I'll find it again on the other side." I folded it carefully and slipped it back where he'd left it. Some things don't need to be sent. They just need to be said aloud to time itself. It was early spring when Grandpa passed. The tulips were just starting to bloom, and the mornings carried that clean, damp smell of soil and new beginnings. We buried him beside Grandma, beneath a maple that had watched over the yard for nearly as long as I'd been alive. After the service, I came back to the house alone. The radio was still there on the table, dusted and waiting. I sat down on the porch. His chair still creaked the same way, and for a while I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. But then, almost on instinct, I reached for the dial. Static, silence, and then a voice, soft, crackling, almost distant. "Good evening, friends. Welcome back to the Saturday Serenade." It couldn't be, I told myself. The station had gone off the air years ago. But there it was, the same announcer's voice, the same slow jazz drifting through the static. I sat there for what felt like an hour, listening. I could almost see them. Grandma in her apron, Grandpa in his work shirt, the two of them side by side as the sun went down. The wind rustled through the porch screens. I whispered, "You found it again, didn't you?" And for a moment, just a heartbeat, I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of someone humming along. When it came time to pack up the house, I took my time. Every drawer held decades, ticket stubs, birthday cards, a seashell from a long-ago trip. The smell of lemon oil and old paper followed me from room to room. The radio, of course, was the hardest thing to move. I couldn't bring myself to box it up. I kept thinking of Grandpa's words, "Some things remember your name." As I was wrapping a stack of old photographs, I found one of them, sitting on that very porch, the radio between them. Her hand rested on his arm, and both were smiling at something outside the frame. The caption on the back, written in Grandma's cursive, said simply, "Our favorite song." I placed the photo beside the radio. When I plugged it in one last time, the light behind the dial flickered faintly. The tubes buzzed, the speakers hummed, and then, clear as a bell, came a few bars of an old melody. Just a fragment, a whisper, but it was enough. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by half-filled boxes, and let the music carry me. It wasn't sadness I felt, not really. It was more like gratitude, the kind that fills your throat until you can't quite speak. When the tune faded, I whispered, "Thank you for keeping the music safe." Years passed. The old house on Sycamore Street changed hands. The trees grew taller, and the radio found its way to a shelf in my own living room. Life, as it tends to, carried me far from where I started. New cities, new responsibilities, new noise. But some evenings, when the light came in soft and gold, I'd catch a familiar stillness. The kind that asked you to sit down, breathe, and listen. One autumn, I took a drive back to the old town. It had been nearly 20 years since Grandpa passed. The streets felt narrower, the storefronts a little faded, but the air, that sweet, dusty smell of late September, was the same. I parked in front of the house, now painted blue instead of white. The porch swing was gone, replaced by a tidy set of wicker chairs. Still, as I stood there, I could almost hear the boards creak the way they used to when Grandpa leaned back, tapping his foot to a rhythm only he could hear. The woman who lived there now was kind. When I explained who I was, she smiled and said, "Oh, you're the grandson. Folks around here still talk about your grandparents. That radio of theirs was famous." I didn't stay long, just long enough to walk the yard and let the memories rise like the smell of rain on dry ground. Before I left, I stood at the gate and whispered, still hearing the songs, "Grandpa." And for a moment, the wind shifted, carrying a faint hum, a sound that felt like laughter. Back home, I set the radio on a small wooden table by the window. It didn't look out of place, even in a world of glowing screens and silent speakers. Some things carry their own gravity, a quiet authority born of having witnessed so much life. I dusted it off, checked the cord, and plugged it in. The tubes glowed faintly, warm as candlelight. Then came the static, gentle, familiar, like the hush before memory begins. At first, nothing. Then, through the soft hum, came a tune. Just a few bars, faint and wandering. I leaned closer. It was the same song Grandpa used to hum on the porch, the one Grandma called their forever tune. It shouldn't have been possible. The station was long gone. But I didn't try to explain it. I just sat there, hands folded, and let it play. The room filled with the smell of dust and sunlight, the faint warmth of tubes glowing orange. For a moment, I was a boy again, cross-legged by the screen door, watching them sway in the fading light. When the music faded, the static stayed. But it didn't feel empty. It sounded alive, like the breath between heartbeats. That summer, I started sitting on my own porch in the evenings, sometimes with a cup of tea, sometimes just with my thoughts. I'd leave the radio playing softly inside, the music spilling out through the open window. Neighbors would walk by and wave. Kids on bikes, couples walking their dogs, the kind of simple, passing moments that fill the fabric of life. Now and then, someone would ask, "What station is that? I haven't heard those songs in years." I'd smile and say, "It's an old one. Not sure it's even on the dial anymore." What I didn't tell them was that it wasn't really the station that mattered. It was a memory, that steady hum of connection that outlasts distance and time. One evening, as twilight slipped in, I caught my reflection in the window. The light from the radio dial flickered softly behind me, the same warm glow that used to shine on Grandpa's face. I thought about all the songs that had passed through that little wooden box, songs of love, loss, laughter, and life. And I realized they were never really gone. They just changed rooms. Now, most nights are in the same way. The sky turns the color of faded denim, and the first stars appear just above the trees. The radio hums quietly, filling the air with that low, comforting warmth. I sit back, close my eyes, and let the past drift in like the evening breeze, not to haunt, but to keep company. If I listen closely, I can still hear them. Grandpa's whistle, Grandma's laughter, the gentle rhythm of a porch swing keeping time with a faraway tune. And somewhere inside that soft, endless static, the music never really stopped. I like to think that what love is, in the end, a song that doesn't need a station. It just needs someone willing to keep listening. There's an old saying Grandpa used to repeat, "Every tune worth hearing finds its way home." Now, as I sit here on my porch, older, slower, a cup of tea cooling beside me, I finally understand what he meant. The songs that shaped us never truly leave. They live on in the rhythm of a quiet evening, in the laughter of neighbors, in the warmth that lingers long after the sun goes down. And as the night deepens, I let the hum of the radio fade into the dark, not an ending, but a promise, that somewhere out there another porch light still glows. Another song is waiting to be remembered,